traditional custodians of the land on which we stand, and acknowledge their leaders emerging past and present. Thank you. This week's Naidoc Week theme is Always Was, Always Will Be. This theme recognises that Indigenous Australians have occupied and cared for this continent for 65,000 years. Indigenous culture is important today as it was 65,000 years ago, and Indigenous Australians remain spiritually and culturally connected to this country. Naidoc Week provides an opportunity for all Australians to reflect on and understand our nation's shared history and the remarkable and ongoing contribution of our Indigenous people, that it always was and it always will be. Indeed, a greater understanding of the role of Indigenous Australians has played in building and shaping the nation we all call home, and it's critical for all Australians. This year, we celebrated Naidoc Week to recognise the history, culture and achievements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The challenge of COVID-19 meant that this year we came together differently to celebrate our community and history. This was often done virtually or in smaller numbers, though it in no way reduced the significance of this year's celebration. Mr Deputy Speaker, as a medical student, I successfully won an AMA travel scholarship. I used this scholarship to travel to the Northern Territory to investigate the high mortality rates for newborns in our Indigenous population in Arnhem Land. What I saw there shocked me. It mirrored what I'd seen on an elective in Kenya just the year before. It was hard to grapple the stark difference between the remote Indigenous communities I was working in and the inner city Melbourne where I had lived. At the time, child and infant mortality rates were off the scale. In 1986, children born then had a life expectancy that was dramatically different from non-Indigenous Australians. Fast forward 30 years, and there has been marked improvement in outcomes for Indigenous women and their children. This is because of concerted efforts of consecutive governments from both sides of the aisle. But it is still not good enough, and the rates of mortality remain twice that of non-Indigenous children. More Indigenous mothers are attending antenatal care earlier and more frequently, and education about risks such as smoking remain lower in women now than they were before. And these are important measures that hopefully will lead to improving outcomes. You can't just wish for outcomes, you need to take action. And it is important that the Closing the Gap report has been refreshed this year by the Prime Minister Scott Morrison, and it has more ambitions for better outcomes. But the target to close the gap in life expectancy between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians within a generation by 2031 is still not on track. Non-Indigenous mortality rates have improved at a similar rate, but unfortunately to non-Indigenous Australians, but unfortunately the gap has not yet narrowed. Mr Deputy Speaker, I firmly believe that education is the key to self-determination, not just for non-Indigenous Australians, but definitely for Indigenous people too. Education leads to better health and social outcomes for all communities around the world, and that is the one takeout from the Closing the Gap report that we can celebrate. And that is that there are better entries of children into prep for Indigenous communities, and there is better retention at Year 12. This means that with more Indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders achieving Year 12 or equivalent qualifications, there'll be more of them attending higher education and more of them entering better jobs and better professions. And this will lead to better outcomes for the Indigenous population and the wider general community. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, as I said in my first speech, a strong country is one that is at peace with its past. Naidoc Week is one small, regular but critical annual event in this journey of healing and understanding. I believe that constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians is a critical next step on that road to a stronger future for all Australians. I thank Minister Ken Wyatt, the Minister for Indigenous Australians, for inviting me to be a member of the Parliamentary Working Group on Constitutional Recognition for Indigenous Australians. Mr Deputy Speaker, Naidoc Week has evolved into a proud tradition which recognises the remarkable and ongoing contribution of our Indigenous people. Modern Australia must recognise our Indigenous people. This may not be and always was, but it most certainly must be and always will be. By reflecting on our past, we can understand the present and look to a better future. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
I thank the member.